Once upon a time, money was a promise that every piece of paper or coin that you had in your pocket was a representation of gold. And at any moment, that paper or coin could be exchanged for real gold sitting in a vault. And that simple promise is what gave money its power. Money represented gold. Gold represented trust, and that trust held entire economies together. But over time, that promise became harder to keep. War, crises, and political choices chipped away at this golden promise. Until finally, in 1971, President Richard Nixon went on television and severed the link between money and gold forever.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets.
And that moment set off a chain reaction. The price of gold shot upwards, inflation spiraled out of control, and US debt began to skyrocket. And from 1971 on, money was no longer backed by anything physical, but it was backed only by trust in the institutions printing it. And so the question of this video is, how did money go from being backed by gold to being backed by nothing at all? And in this video, that's the story I want to tell, because Richard Nixon's decision in 1971 wasn't an isolated incident, but it was the climax of a centuries-long story of trust, conflict, and power. And so in order to understand why money works the way it does today, we need to go back to the very beginning, around 5000 BC, with the origin of money. Throughout this story, we're going to see money change forms, whether it's shells, gold, oil, or institutions. But no matter how its form changes, one thing will always remain true. Money is a system built on trust. Without trust, money doesn't work no matter what the commodity is. And so, in order to understand money, let's start off at the very beginning. The earliest form of money appeared in the barter system, where you had a resource like a grain and traded with someone who wanted a grain, like a shoemaker. However, although this worked on small trades, it didn't work on scale. What if the shoemaker doesn't want your grain? Well, to solve this problem, society started using commodities as a means of exchange, like cowrie shells in West Africa, salt in ancient Rome, and cacao beans in the Aztec and Mayan world. But whatever commodity was used, the pattern was the same. Money had to be scarce, durable, and recognizable. But eventually, one commodity rose above them all because its unique qualities, precious metals. They were divisible, portable, and durable. And eventually, precious metals revolutionized trade because markets could expand, empires could trade across continents, and money carried a universal value. And over time, one metal stood above the rest, which brings me to the next part of our story. In 1821, the rise of the gold standard. By the 1800s, gold was becoming the world's standard commodity, and the immediate question is, why gold? What is it about this metal that makes it so universal? Well, gold is rare, but not too rare. It's resistant to corrosion, and it's universally desired across cultures. And in 1821, the British Empire was the first major power to formally adopt the gold standard, where the pound sterling was directly backed by gold. People could convert paper notes into gold on demand. And over time, other large economies began to adopt the gold standard, like France, Germany, Japan, and finally the US. And this is often called the first wave of modern globalization because trade, migration, and investment were all anchored by the same commodity, gold. And the gold standard was so attractive around the world because it created stability. It limited inflation and held its value. Trust, governments couldn't print endless amounts of it. Simplicity, exchange rates were fixed. And economic power, being on gold showed credibility. And for nearly a century, the gold standard worked remarkably well, but it only worked in times of peace and prosperity. And once crises hit, it would show its cracks and then be replaced. Which brings me to the next part of our story, in the early 1900s, in the rise of the gold exchange standard. By the early 1900s, gold was reaching its breaking point, and that was because of World War I in 1914. When the war began, governments needed large sums of money to finance the war, and so one by one, countries suspended the gold standard. Ordinary citizens could no longer walk into a bank and exchange their paper notes for gold. For the first time in nearly a century, money wasn't tied to gold, but it was tied to government promises. And because of the increase in war spending, inflation surged, currencies were no longer stable, and gold reserves around the world depleted. But for one country, it was a very different story, the United States. Because the US was far away from the fighting, its economy remained intact, and as Europe bought US food, weapons, and supplies, their gold flowed across the Atlantic, and by the end of the war, the US held the world's largest stockpile. And after the war, governments wanted to restore stability and go back to the gold standard. But this world after the war wasn't the same. Too much money had been printed, debt had piled up, and gold reserves were unequally distributed. And after many failed attempts to bring it back, a new system appeared, and it was called the gold exchange standard, where instead of every country holding its own gold, only a few key powers like the US and Britain would hold it. Other nations held their reserves in those currencies, which could then be exchanged for gold. In practice, that meant if Belgium pegged its franc to the pound, and the pound was pegged to gold, then indirectly, the franc was tied to gold. On the surface, it looked like the world returned to gold, but underneath, the system was fragile and unbalanced. And as we entered the 30s, this system would collapse, which leads me to 1933, when gold became illegal in America. By the early 1930s, the world was in a free fall. The Great Depression shattered economies everywhere. Banks were failing, unemployment was soaring, and international trade collapsed. The gold exchange standard in the 20s was unraveling under pressure, and Britain abandoned it in 1931, and many other countries followed as they couldn't defend the gold peg. But in the United States, the story played out a little bit differently. America still had the largest gold reserves, but as panic set in, citizens rushed to exchange their dollars for gold, leaving the system closer to collapse. And at this moment, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stepped in and made the most dramatic decision in American monetary history, Executive Order 6102, which made it illegal for American citizens to own most forms of gold. Citizens were forced to turn in their gold to the Federal Reserve, and in exchange, they would be given paper dollars or faced fines or imprisonment. And this was a very big shift, where gold moved from the hands of the people to the vaults of the government. And shortly after, the government passed the Gold Reserve Act of 1934, which transferred all U.S. gold to the U.S. Treasury, prohibited the redemption of dollars for gold, and authorized the president to set the value of the dollar in terms of gold at a new higher rate. And that rate would change from $25 per ounce to $35 per ounce, devaluing the dollar by 40%, allowing the government to print more money. But Roosevelt's gold ban wasn't just about seizing all the gold, but it was about rewriting the relationship between gold and citizens. From that moment on, only governments and central banks could deal in gold. Ordinary citizens had to use paper money. And while America was rewriting the rules at home, a bigger shift was about to happen abroad, and America had the leverage to write the rules of the next monetary system. In 1944, Bretton Woods, the dollar takes control. Near the end of World War II, Europe was bankrupt and its economies were shattered, but the US was different. It held 2/3 of the world's gold reserves in an economy untouched by war. And because of that, America would have the leverage to set the rules of the next global financial system, and those new rules would be set in July of 1944 in the Bretton Woods Conference, where 44 nations attended. Its purpose: build a system for stable trade and manage the world's economy. And in this conference, they created a new monetary system, and this is how it worked. Countries would peg their currency to the US dollar at a fixed rate, and the US dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 an ounce, in which foreign governments and banks could exchange their currency for gold. And at the time, people thought this system would work because US had a massive gold reserve to back its promise, and the dollar seemed incredibly credible. However, there was one flaw to this system. It meant that the world's trust in money rested on US discipline. And that promise, as the world would learn, was built on shaky ground, which leads me to the 1960s, when the world called America's bluff. Bretton Woods was built on one simple promise: 1 ounce of gold equals $35. But by the 1960s, that promise was looking a little bit shaky. The United States was spending unfathomable amounts of money on the Vietnam War, Great Society programs, and for the first time, America was importing more than it exported, sending even more dollars abroad. The US printed more dollars, while its gold reserves stayed finite, and the world started to question, could America really keep its golden promise? If every country started asking for gold in exchange for dollars, could the US supply it? The world was starting to think that America was bluffing, and in 1965, the president of France, Charles de Gaulle, called America's bluff, saying the US had exorbitant privilege of the dollar. America could print dollars to pay for its deficits, while other countries had to hold the bag, and de Gaulle feared that the dollar would eventually be devalued against gold, and other countries would pay the price. And in 1965, France began exchanging its dollars for gold, shipping tons of gold across the Atlantic to repatriate their gold reserves, which was allowed under the Bretton Woods system, and shortly after, other countries followed suit. And over time, the US gold reserves steadily declined. In 1950, the US had 21,000 metric tons of gold, but by 1971, we only had 8,500 metric tons. In 1971, the dollar was no longer trusted as good as gold. American allies were cashing in their chips, and President Nixon was running out of options, and we have finally reached the moment of truth. 1971, the Nixon Shock. We have now reached the climax of our story. The world was demanding gold in exchange for dollars, and President Richard Nixon was faced with an impossible decision. He could either 1. Defend Bretton Woods and risk losing the rest of the US gold reserves, or 2. Defend the American economy and exit Bretton Woods. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. And on Sunday, August 15th of 1971, Richard Nixon was ready to tell the American people his decision. And here's what he said.
I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets.
The dollar was no longer attached to gold, and the world was shocked. European allies accused the US betraying its allies to solve its own problems. And the markets went into chaos. And months later, under the Smithsonian Agreement, the dollar was devalued, and other currencies were revalued against it. But by 1973, the old system was completely broken, and other currencies floated against the dollar. Their values were now set by supply and demand in currency markets, rather than fixed in gold. The global market was transformed. Money was no longer a promise backed by gold, but it was fiat, backed only by trust in the US government. And America was about to find out what that meant in the 1970s, the Aftershock. Shortly after the dollar became a fiat currency, along with many other factors, the US entered a terrible decade, the 1970s. Inflation was out of control, raising the price of food, energy, and everyday goods higher and higher, while their savings accounts lost value and American wages stagnated. This, combined with high unemployment, created stagflation, which was something economists didn't believe was possible. And on top of this, another crisis hit, the 1973 oil embargo, which was an oil embargo by OPEC set on the US for supporting Israel, which quadrupled the price of gas in the US and created energy shortages. And with all this chaos and gold out of the picture, America needed its new anchor to keep the dollar as the world's currency. And in that 1973 crisis, they found it. The oil crisis made it clear. Oil, not gold, had become the world's most powerful commodity. Which leads us to 1974, the petrodollar. After the chaos of the early 70s, America needed to restore faith in the US dollar. And in 1974, the US struck a deal with Saudi Arabia, and the agreement was simple. Saudi Arabia would price all oil sales in US dollars, and they would invest the surplus oil profits, or petrodollars, back into US banks and treasury bonds. And in return, the US would provide military protection and weapons to Saudi Arabia. The dollar would become the currency of oil, and this would secure its spot as the world's currency because every country in the world needed oil. So now every country in the world would need US dollars to buy it. It created an artificial demand for dollars worldwide, giving it its second life. But at home, the dollar was still facing a major problem, inflation, that was reaching double digits. And that's when Paul Volcker, the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, declared war on inflation in 1979, the Volcker Shock. By the end of the 70s, America was suffering with inflation, and that is when Paul Volcker declared war on inflation and raised interest rates to over 20%, where borrowing became impossible, whether it was with mortgages, cars, and loans. And in the short term, it was painful. Unemployment was at 10%. Farmers were driving their tractors to the Federal Reserve, and small businesses closed. The US fell in its worst recession since the Great Depression, but that short-term pain worked. By 1982, inflation was solved. The dollar stabilized, and faith in America's currency was restored, which set the stage for the new era of American financial dominance in the 80s and 90s, the dollar's reign. By the mid-80s, the dollar was looking strong again. The petrodollar system ensured worldwide demand, and the Volcker shock ended inflation at home. Confidence was restored, and everyone was flocking to the dollar. But this time, its power was not based on gold, but it was now seen as the language of global finance. Treasury bonds became seen as a safe asset. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the fall of the ruble, the dollar became the world's undisputed global currency. If Japan and Mexico did a trade deal, it was in dollars. But although this was good for the US, other countries, developing countries specifically in Latin America, borrowed heavily in dollars, and when interest rates went high in the 80s, it drove up their debt payments, and Latin America entered the lost decade, where they were unable to pay their debts, faced high inflation, declining income, and increased unemployment. And at the same time, America was starting to develop some bad habits. We started to run massive trade deficits and borrowed endlessly, increasing our national debt because the world had no choice but to keep buying dollars. So while the dollar's dominance looked like strength, it was also a very fragile system. The world had tied itself to a single fiat currency backed by the US government, and that meant that America's problems could quickly become everyone's problems. And that test would come in 2008, the Fiat stress test. By the 2000s, the dollar seemed unstoppable, powering trade, dominating finance, and trusted as the world's safe haven. But in 2008, the global financial crisis exposed how fragile this system was. The housing market was in a bubble, and when it burst, banks collapsed, stock markets crashed, and millions lost their homes. This was the first true test of the fiat system solely based on trust. If money had no anchor and the dollar was just a promise, could it survive the worst financial panic since the Great Depression? Well, at first, while America was starting to implode, it seemed like the world might abandon the dollar. But what actually happened was the opposite. Investors fled investments like corporate stocks and bonds and rushed to buy dollars and US Treasury bonds. The dollar strengthened during the crisis because it was seen as the safest asset in a storm, and so the Fed opened the floodgates and started printing trillions of dollars to bail out banks, rescue the economy, and stabilize the market. And other countries kept buying US debt because no matter how flawed the dollar was, there was no alternative. It was too big and powerful to fail. And in 2025, I think the question on many people's minds is, when will the next empire fall? We have now reached the end of our story. The dollar still remains as the world's global currency. It makes up 58% of global reserves and 54% of foreign trade invoices. However, with debt rising, rivals growing stronger, and new technologies like digital currencies emerging, many are asking, when will the next empire fall? Well, if this story has taught us anything, it is that every monetary system, whether it's shells, gold, oil, or paper, eventually breaks. That is a guarantee. The real question is when. And the answer to that question is nobody knows. And I want to make it clear that I am not an expert in this topic. I am simply a YouTuber who went down a rabbit hole. And so as a YouTuber who went down a rabbit hole, I want to share my 3 big takeaways that I learned from researching this video. 1, America has been extremely lucky. Since making these historical video essays, I have really been focused on America in the 20th century. And the reason for that is because once you do the research for one video, you end up finding a lot of other topics that are worthy of their own video essays, and they keep piling on top of each other. And one thing I've come to realize through all this research is how lucky America has been up to this point. America was lucky in its timing. It rose while Europe was falling. Lucky in its geography. Oceans and resources shielded it from destruction. And lucky in its wars. Every global conflict that weakened others strengthened the US. And that luck played as much of a role in America's dominance as any policy or strategy did. 2, things that have never happened before happen all the time. One of the biggest lessons of this story is how often money changes in ways that no one expects. I mean, think about this story. No one thought the gold standard would collapse in World War I. No one imagined Americans would be banned from owning gold in the 30s. No one predicted that in 1971, the US would suddenly break the dollar from gold forever. History shows us that the biggest financial shifts are the ones that no one saw coming. And finally, money will always be a soap opera. If there's just one more thing that this story shows us, it's that money is never boring. It's a drama, it's a conflict, it's winners and it's losers. From gold rushes to bank runs, from Nixon on TV to oil shocks. In financial crisis, money has always been the center of power struggles. And the reason is simple. Money isn't just paper or metal, but it's human trust. And when human trust is involved, there will always be fear, greed, politics, and betrayal. So keep the popcorn machine running and expect a soap opera from money until the day you die. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a like, subscribe to my channel for more videos like it, and if you want to hear another very interesting story about the real reason boomers are retiring broke, my #1 smash hit of the year, give this video a watch next. And with that, muchas gracias, que tengan un buen día, nos vemos chicos.